Welcome to the Drift and Ramble podcast. I'm Steve Blizin. Each episode will explore true stories and American legends. From the pages of history and a few stories handed down over the years, we'll look at the people, places, and events that helped shape a nation. Stories of survival, notable frontiermen and women, explorers who struck it rich, and the outlaws that stole it from them. There'll be studies of saloon girls, swindlers, banditry, and bad men, profiles of lawmen and American Indians, and the good and evil that existed between them. We'll amble through the past. We'll delve into the folklore of the times and maybe even uncover a ghost story or two. So, saddle up or settle in for the Drift and Ramble podcast. 3 Prospectors: The True Value of Money is in its Use. This story is a work of fiction that I originally wrote for another show. I hope you enjoy it. I was there the year San Francisco exploded. Men traveled across the oceans and the entire continent to become part of this kind of mass hysteria that only greed can bring. It was the great gold rush of 1849. Farmers laid down their pitchforks. Trappers sold off their furs, and city slickers and desperados came out of the woodwork to step into the rivers, hills, and valleys of California. Men dropped everything to get here in hopes of getting rich. "The ground is scattered with gold," they'd say. "It's just right there for the picking. Nuggets the size of a baby's head," they'd holler. "So much gold it would pull your britches down to fill your pockets." Rainbow chasers, they called us, all dreaming of striking that mother lode. San Francisco was awash in mud, miners, and tent cabins. Disease and pestilence were the order of the day. Men carried the consumption off their boats and into the crowds. The 3 of us, me, Jim Stroud, and Henry Crawford, decided we would work the placer deposits along the South Fork of the American River. Quick as we could, we got supplied and left for Sutter's Mill. Turned out we weren't the only folks with that idea. Got so crowded in parts you couldn't swing your pickaxe without hitting the man behind you or one in front. Tempers got the best of men, and fights over a piece of dirt were as regular as a bird song each morning. Spring turned into summer, and summer turned into fall. Folks scoured the banks of that river like buzzards on a dead coyote. They snapped up every speck of gold dust they could find. A few fellas got rich, but most just got greedy. They'd steal each other's supplies in the night, and if a man lay dying, they'd just assume empty his pockets and take his boots. Very few dead men ever made it underground. Them bones became a reminder that not everybody found their fortunes out west. Henry Crawford got a notion to keep following that river. He said, "I reckon that gold washed down from somewhere, and I'm going to find it. Every last bit of that mother lode." So off we went, right up the river behind them. The farther up we went, the harder the conditions. Nights were cold and supplies were thin. Jimmy said he wanted to go back and get provisions, but old Henry wasn't about to stop on account of poor supplies. We struck deeper and further on up into them mountains until Henry found his first nugget. A big old hunk of pure gold as big as a man's thumb. It must have weighed nearly a pound or more. We set up camp and worked our pans all day, and we shivered all through the night. Jimmy came down with the consumption, and he coughed and wheezed so bad we weren't sure he was going to make it. But we were on the gold, and Henry wasn't about to give up or give in. Just barely a week after Jimmy first got sick, he died in his sleep. Henry couldn't be bothered, so I buried Jim under a nice tree on the sunny side of the mountain. I was sour and ready to go home. We were cold, hungry, muddy, and tired, and pert near 100 miles from the nearest town. We had gold, lots of it. So much so, we was putting it in anything with a pocket. We even filled up both of old Jimmy's boots. I divided up his clothes, blankets, and rations, which lasted us a couple more days, but we finally run out of food. So Henry shot Jimmy's mule. Now, you might already know this, but there ain't nothing satisfying about eating a dead mule. But the snow kept the meat cold and the buzzards at bay. I wanted to leave, but old Henry kept finding them nuggets. I even found a few myself. The next morning, we were setting up our last pot of coffee when this greenhorn come rattling through the wilderness, scaring off all the birds. He was just carrying on, singing, laughing, talking to himself like a crazy person. His mule was just as crazy, braying like his tail was caught in a bear trap. Henry told him to set a spell and convinced the man to get out his coffee, and we sat by the fire while that crazy greenhorn just kept yammering on. Said he come all the way from Pennsylvania and had a big old slab of fresh bacon strapped to the side of his pack mule. Henry looked at me like he was fixing to put a plan in motion. We sat and ate our breakfast, and then Henry got real excited about the Colt revolver that man was carrying in his waistcoat. Henry told the stranger, "That's a damn fine pistol you got there, Greenhorn. Mind if I look it over?" And when the Greenhorn handed it to Henry, Henry cocked the lever back and pointed it at that man just as easy as you please. Now, old Henry ain't no gunfighter, and he ain't much for fisticuffs either. Fact is, I ain't never seen him swat a fly until he shot old Jimmy's mule. But I'll be damned if he didn't tell that greenhorn, "Ain't nobody gonna get my gold." And then he just pulled that trigger quick as you please and shot that poor greenhorn dead between the eyes. He never had the chance to drink his coffee. "What the hell'd you do that for, Henry?" I hollered. The greenhorn toppled over and fell face first into the fire. I drug him back out before he burned up in that nice new buckskin jacket he was wearing. Henry just stood there for the longest time with a glassy look in his eyes. The poor old greenhorn was probably close to death anyway. His hands, nose, and feet was black with frostbite, and he was yammering some kind of gibberish all during breakfast. I couldn't make heads or tails out of what he was saying. I took his coat, and old Henry took his boots, and we commenced eating almost all of that bacon. We tied off his mule, and Henry said, "I ain't gonna let nobody get my gold." Just blurted it out like he was answering a question. I got the shovel out and buried the man up behind a big boulder on the hill. Never did get his name. The winter months sure can be treacherous in these parts, and I was glad the spring thaw was finally coming. We run out of places to keep all that gold. Every container was filled up or overflowing. Got so's we was getting careless. I told Henry I was going to take my share back to San Francisco and buy me a saloon. Well, that didn't set too well with Henry. We argued about that all night up until I went to sleep. I woke up later that night to find him standing over me with that pistol, like he was thinking about pulling the trigger. I says to him, "You go on and pull that trigger, Henry. I'll haunt you the rest of your days." I suppose that must have spooked him some because he didn't do it, but he sure did seem to think hard on it for a spell. The next morning, the river was high, and we could see it was rising. Spring thaw had set in, and the snow in the high mountains was beginning to melt. Water was getting up around the piles of gold, and Henry was in a panic to get to higher ground. We could barely lift that box we filled, but we drug it a few paces from the water line. Henry took both of them boots filled with gold and tied a rope between them so's he could carry them around his neck like saddlebags. By the time he was finished, the water was already up around his ankles. Seemed like no time at all before that river turned angry. Big old roots and branches was skittering past us like a freight train at full speed. Henry kept trying to lift that box of gold while I drew up stakes and ran our supplies way up the hill. By the time I tied off the mules and got back to the river, old Henry was up to his chest in that cold, muddy water. I hollered, "Let go of that gold and I'll throw you a rope." Henry just blinked at me like he didn't understand what I was saying. I stepped into the river and got about as close as I could to Henry. I threw out the rope, but he couldn't seem to grasp it. His eyes was dull and his face was turning blue from the cold. 5 times I hit Henry about square in the face with that rope, and 5 times he just let it drop back into the water. Finally, he held out one of them boots just long enough so I could grasp it. I pulled that boot back hard into my chest, but the moment I did, this big tree came down the river and knocked old Henry down. The rope on the boot snapped, and Henry went straight under. I stood there with that boot full of gold and watched old Henry tumble away. I knew I couldn't do nothing but hightail it up the mountain before the river got any higher. The water was wild, and I knew there was no way in hell I was ever going to lay eyes on Henry again. I spent a long time wandering the mountains thinking about them days. How we froze, damn near starved, and how Henry killed that man just to get supplies we could have easily just paid for with our gold. When I did finally make it back to San Francisco, I bought my saloon. I turned that boot full of gold into a house full of finery, and I never spent another night shivering through the cold again. Eventually, I sold the saloon, bought me a fine cattle ranch in the neighboring county, built a little schoolhouse too, raised up my family, and I reckon that's how I came to be your grandpa. If Henry Crawford taught me anything, I reckon it's that a boot full of gold ain't worth nothing but a shoe full of rocks. A pile of gold ain't worth nothing unless you put it to use. This story was adapted from the moral, "The value of money is in its use."
The Drift and Ramble podcast is a Clear Voice Media production, hosted and produced by Steve Blizin, with segment research and voice acting by Cheryl Blizin. Additional contributions and content have been made possible by support from individuals dedicated to the art and science of storytelling and exploring the still fertile promise of the American West.
The Drift and Ramble podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and just about anywhere else podcasts are found. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and now on Patreon.com, where you can find details on how to access exclusive content. You can get all the details at patreon.com/driftandramble. That's patreon.com/driftandramble. Thank you for your support.